So, welcome everybody to Sustainable Superheroes. This season, we've very much focused on biodiversity net gain with conversations from large scale developers, perspective from environmental banks, and a legal perspective so far. Today, we'll take a slightly different view and we're going to be focused on natural capital, which is often viewed as very complementary to biodiversity or perhaps the next stage in its evolution. With me today, I have John Nichols from AtkinsRéalis. John is a chartered environmentalist and a soil scientist. He has a background in environmental science, system dynamics, and responsible business. He's a lead in natural capital and environmental economics at AtkinsRéalis and has had many years in consultancy, delivering on projects across the water sector, transport, flood protection schemes, national infrastructure, and nature-based carbon capture projects. So please give a warm welcome to our guest today. John, may I ask if you could add on to that introduction and if you could say a little bit more about your work at AtkinsRéalis?
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks very much for the invitation to Sustainability Superheroes. Yeah, great to be here and thanks to the audience for joining. So yeah, totally right. Like my background is in environmental science and I originally started out, as you say, in soil science, and that was making the case for reusing soil materials on major infrastructure projects as part of environmental impact assessment. So thinking about this kind of natural asset as an asset, how can that be used to benefit the project and mitigate environmental impacts? And that's what got me interested in how to communicate the value of nature to business. So, as you say, I lead the natural capital and environmental economics team at AtkinsRéalis. And you may know of AtkinsRéalis by our former name of Atkins. So, we're a global engineering and project management consultancy. We've got over 50,000 staff globally. And a lot of the clients I work with are in the water sector, transport, local government, and more widely, we work in urban development, defence, energy, and mining. And my role essentially is focused on making the business case for nature, so helping infrastructure organisations and developers to manage their natural assets in a way that maximises the positive outcomes for their business and their infrastructure projects, and also for nature. So yeah, that's AtkinsRéalis and the kind of work that we do there.
Thank you, John. Let's start with the basics. How do we describe natural capital, what it is, and how organisations can adopt a natural capital approach?
Great. Well, yeah, thanks for the question. And this is exactly where I like to start when talking about these topics with landowners or infrastructure organizations and other types of clients. And the first thing is to just distinguish some really key terminology. So distinguishing what are natural capital assets versus what is a natural capital approach to decision making. So natural assets are those stocks of renewable and non-renewable natural resources that combine to yield a flow of benefits to people. And often we think about those natural capital assets in terms of habitats. So our woodlands, our wetlands, rivers, our farmland, peatland, also salt marshes, the marine environment, coastal ecosystems, but also our urban parks and green spaces. And they're all assets because they deliver these flows of ecosystem services to people. And those flows of benefits underpin our economy, they underpin our well-being, and they also directly contribute to infrastructure developers' core objectives. So some great examples of that are, during COVID, we became very aware of the green spaces around us. And I think we have a much better appreciation now of the role of green spaces around where we live. And they also have a tangible impact on house prices. They tend to be higher in areas with access to green space. But also for infrastructure developers, a lot of the built assets that infrastructure developers or owners use, whether that's real estate or whether that's large pipelines or electricity transmission, those assets impact on natural assets, of course, through development, but they are also dependent on natural assets, protection from flooding. So there might be a road or a pipeline, and upstream there might be some woodland and peatland that helps to slow the flow of water that may impact that asset. So that's another example of an ecosystem service which regulates floodwaters. So that's what we mean by natural capital and ecosystem services. And it's really about thinking of nature as an asset. And that then takes us into the natural capital approach, which is how we use those concepts in order to essentially support decision making. And there's a number of different ways that we can do that. So there is when we might think about assessing a project. So it might be that a new reservoir, let's say, is going to involve the change in land use and land management from, let's say, a predominantly agricultural area to obviously a big water body, and then a large amount of environmental mitigation and planting surrounding that. And we can use the natural capital approach to look at, well, what are the wider benefits of the mitigation that we have to do for the purpose of meeting new regulations like biodiversity net gain, but also minimizing impacts on environmental receptors. And we can use that view of those wider benefits in order to help build the business case for doing that kind of environmental mitigation, and then capturing that as a developer, whether that's to bolster the planning application or to support funding and getting investment into that scheme. So that's an example of how we might use a natural capital approach. And yeah, happy to talk about other examples like optioneering, natural capital accounting, corporate risk and reporting. So yeah, if any of those are things you want to talk about a bit more.
Well, I think we understand some of the principles there. Thank you. That's wonderful. But let's just turn this to a standard or overarching framework for how we use natural capital approaches, particularly at an international level or if not at a national level.
Okay, so the sort of frameworks and guidance that we might be using with that. Yeah. Okay, so internationally, we've got what's called the Natural Capital Protocol, which has been released by the Capitals Coalition, and that's a globally applicable resource. I'd really recommend anyone going to the Capitals Coalition website. They've got some great training materials on undertaking a natural capital approach to managing your business and the interfaces and identifying the interfaces between your business and the natural environment. So that's the kind of overarching piece. We also have the UN's system of environmental and economic accounting, and that sets out the methodologies and approaches for natural capital accounting internationally. We also have some ISO standards, 14,007 and 14,008 on the valuation of environmental benefits. And I'm sure we'll get into discussing this point about valuation shortly. So there's those things happening at the international scale. In the UK, though, I would say we're quite lucky in that we've actually got a range of standards and guidance and frameworks specific to the UK. And the first port of call I'd always recommend is DEFRA's guidance, Enabling a Natural Capital Approach, or ENCA. And that provides some introductory guidance on the principles, but also a range of different ways in which we might take a natural capital approach. So I mentioned before this assessment of a project or a scheme. It also sets out how we can assess policies and programs, natural capital accounting. So that's a really great resource. And it's not just guidance, it's actually a whole toolkit as well. So that will provide you with some standard tools, some standard metrics, quantitative metrics, valuation metrics that we can refer to. And what's really good about that is it provides a more standardized approach for the UK as a whole, which is fantastic. And it signposts to a number of different tools that we have, many of which are actually publicly available and open source. So there's a lot that we can draw on in the UK. And there's a couple of other things I'd just like to mention as well, which are sort of relatively new. One is the British Standard 8632, which provides a British standard on natural capital accounting for organisations. That's now actually being developed into an international standard as well, which is really, really exciting. And the other thing we need to mention, of course, is the TNFD framework. This is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and that's a new international reporting framework. And what that enables us to do is not just looking at our individual schemes and our developments and our projects, but it helps us to look at, as an organization, where are our impacts and dependencies on nature, and how does that translate into risks and opportunities at the whole business level, at the corporate level, and how does that actually influence the bottom line ultimately. And that's now a voluntary framework that came out last year. And the expectation is that in time that will become mandatory. And then, yes, if you're in the water sector as well, I should say, which is where I work a lot, is that some industries do have some specific guidance and frameworks and tools. So where I've worked a lot and where AtkinsRéalis works a lot is in the water sector. And that does have some natural capital specific guidance in the last round of water resources planning, and also as part of the water industry's national environment programme in England. It was required to undertake a natural capital assessment of your options that you're looking to invest in and thinking of using to supply water. And the expectation is that, that's probably going to be part of the next water industry investment cycle as well. And what's interesting about that is, because the water sector is arguably leading in this space in the UK, we're actually able to transfer many of those methods and tools to other types of infrastructure like roads, other kinds of transport, housing, defence, and other areas as well. So yeah, that's been a great resource for us as well.
I've certainly seen some of that with the BEST model being adopted for developers for sustainable urban drainage as well. Let's come back to that in a few minutes' time. Natural capital frameworks used and what the main benefit is. So would you describe, why do this? What's the benefit for the user?
Yeah, so I would say the benefits often tie to the purpose, and I'll sort of draw on a few examples to kind of illustrate that. But the main benefit ultimately is, in order for either infrastructure developers, asset owners to recognize the role of nature in delivering their objectives, whether that be looking at things like woodland planting could deliver carbon sequestration benefits, as well as helping to increase the resilience of their assets to things like flooding and regulating temperatures in a microclimate to help protect their assets from climate change. So it's connecting in that direction, but it's also about recognizing and drawing out the wider benefits that their infrastructure developments may have where they are investing in building our stocks of natural capital. So whether that's environmental mitigation on a road scheme to, provide screening planting, whether that's biodiversity net gain using those undertaking creation and enhancement of habitat, which generates biodiversity and habitat units. But that can also deliver a range of other benefits. If that's in a publicly accessible space, that can provide recreation benefits, education benefits, health benefits. So it also ties into this whole discussion around social value as well. So it's enabling that connection. And from some examples that I've worked on, so in the transport space, typically what we need to do there is develop a business case for a transport scheme. And that's focused on traditional benefits like job creation, value add. That's looking at how's that going to affect journey times and these kind of aspects. And it's not the case with all schemes necessarily, but there are a sort of a subset of transport schemes where incorporating a natural capital assessment can actually make a difference to your business case and tip the balance in favor of that being considered an economically advantageous investment. So where that's made a difference has been on like a local transportation scheme. That was actually a scheme that was designed to service a guided bus route in England. And the traditional benefits weren't stacking up for the business case to justify that investment. And because that development also needed to deliver biodiversity net gain to align with the new requirements through the Environment Act, it needed to obviously create and enhance habitat in a way that delivered a net gain. And they also had things like SUDs and small elements of natural flood management associated with that. And because we were able to use a natural capital assessment to quantify and also value, and we might get into this in a moment, those benefits, it was actually able to be added into the business case and improve the kind of benefit side of the cost benefit equation. So that's where it can really make a difference by considering that wider value of environmental mitigation. The other way in which this kind of approach can make a difference is in optioneering and making the business case for nature-based solutions. So one of the advantages of using nature-based solutions to traditional infrastructure problems, and we see this especially in water treatment, reducing flooding and runoff, is that nature-based solutions can deliver a wider range of benefits than more standard sort of engineering type solutions. And by using this kind of natural capital approach to quantify and, where possible, value those, we can actually make a case to demonstrate that this kind of approach delivers more benefits than others. And there's a bit of nuance around there. It's not always nature-based solution or hard solution. Often there's a hybrid. So if you're thinking about that sort of hybrid, then it can make the case for including those green elements as well. And then the sorry.
I was just going to say that kind of picks up on the project-based approaches, but let's just a little bit on why a company is doing it for reporting purposes. So that links back to TNFD 27, doesn't it, with corporate reporting?
Yeah, good point. So how this links in back to that is, I would say that things like the TNF, they are helping with reporting. Obviously, it's all about disclosure reporting, but in a way, the report element and the disclosure is kind of the end of the process. It's a framework to help to identify and then manage the ways in which your business may be exposed to nature risks and opportunities. And quite interestingly, there was a legal opinion produced by CCLI quite recently, which was showing that according to the UK Companies Act, company directors potentially actually at risk if they're not able to, at risk of litigation, if they're not able to demonstrate that they are aware of and managing the company's nature-related risks. And this is, regardless of whether TNFD is a mandatory requirement or not. So the fact that we have TNFD is giving us a framework for managing those nature-related risks and opportunities. And so as an organization, this could be a way to reduce risk, but also make that case for investing in natural capital assets. And one of the most satisfying moments that I've had with clients is when you're in a room and you've got together key individuals across the business, and this becomes not only something that the environmental teams are dealing with, because we're talking about company risks and that affects the bottom line, is when the company CFO is saying, wow, we actually notice and realize that natural assets are key to our business, just like our built assets and our financial assets. So that's another way that this makes the difference. It kind of translates nature into business speak, if you like, and it therefore enables more effective action to be taken to reduce those risks and of course tackle the nature and biodiversity crisis that we're experiencing.
Yeah, I agree. I think one day we will see environmental teams probably reporting directly to the CFO, who knows. I come across organizations talking about financial markets and ecosystem services, which sounds very much like offsetting. Is this the same or is it different? Is there a market for natural capital ecosystem service products in that kind of way? Or are they the same thing?
Yeah, so there's a few things there. So when it comes to markets, and this gets into the whole sort of what are we really doing when we're quantifying and valuing the benefits of natural assets and ecosystem services. So markets, offsetting is a part of it, but I would say that there are established markets for only a very small number of ecosystem services in carbon, for example, and that's limited in the UK to certain habitats, i.e. woodland and peatland, and the carbon credits that can be generated through woodland creation and peatland restoration. We could also say that there is emerging or being established a market for biodiversity net gain, and you could say that is about offsetting and going beyond offsetting, because it's about a net gain. So we can change land use and land management through habitat creation or enhancement. And if we can verify those changes and sell them as a credit, then that is something that can be sold. But I would say that the markets are not just about offsetting. Interestingly, very large infrastructure organizations, maybe they own land across lots of different parts of the UK. They have different divisions within that organization. There's also this idea of insetting. So some clients we're seeing are using the verification systems that are needed for entering some of these environmental markets, like the Woodland Carbon Code, for example, in order to kind of inset or offset the kind of offsetting the impacts of their organization in different parts of their business is then delivered by another part of the business, and they use these verification standards to verify that that's been delivered. And we're also seeing that clients are essentially offsetting their capital schemes using their own land holdings, so they actively using that asset. But something I did want to mention on that quantification side is, if we think that where there's the market for ecosystem services is a very small part of the whole value that asset is delivering, and some of that value we can only quantify in a socio-economic way. We can't sell that value, but we can appreciate what that asset is delivering for people in society, and that is also a small component of what we can quantify in terms of those flows and benefits. And there are also natural assets, the ecosystem services, that we just can't quantify and we can't value, and we can only appreciate them in a qualitative way. So it's really important to realize that the natural capital approach, a key part of it is quantification and valuation, but there are just some things that we can't yet quantify and value, and it is an evolving area.
So I don't think we're going to touch on this later on. So let's maybe work in a few examples of some of those things which you can either quantify or can't quantify, but there is markets for them. So I think when we think of things like air quality, and air quality is made up of a basket of different ecosystem services there, and how to quantify them is really around healthcare avoidance. So it is a socio-economic benefit, but it's effectively free. So there is no marketplace for that kind of thing. But could you give us a few examples of the different types of ecosystem services here, just so I think everybody can get their head around the range beyond carbon, biodiversity, and perhaps nutrient neutrality would be added to that basket as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So one way that we can kind of break the ecosystem services down is we can think about provisioning services. So these are things like food and timber. We can often quantify those, and using things like yield, the tons of a crop that can be produced, or the tons of timber, and those do have market prices, and we can use those to infer, well, what's the contribution of the natural environment to producing those versus inputs that we may have to that process. There are then regulating services. So we've mentioned things like regulating floodwaters, so we can quantify essentially the capacity or the volume of water that can be held back and retained by certain ecosystems. What we can do in some cases in terms of valuation is put a value on the number of properties that are affected if there is flooding or if there was flooding. What's interesting about that one is that sometimes we use a UK-wide metric or an indicator for that, but that's based on, and many of these values are based on individual studies. So that value of those properties will obviously vary depending on where in the country that flooding may or may not occur. So that's an interesting caveat there. So regulating services, you mentioned, Steve, the air quality regulation. So this is how our urban green infrastructure ultimately helps to absorb pollutants from the air, and we can quantify that in terms of there's things called PM 2.5, which is a very small particle, the quantity of that which is prevented from being deposited, for example, and as you say, that can then be valued in terms of healthcare avoided. Other things like carbon sequestration, we've also got water purification, so nutrients, runoff of nutrients from farmland, and this is really interesting in this space of nutrient neutrality, which is about trying to offset the nutrient impacts of new developments by changing the way that we use farmland elsewhere in a catchment. So this is all about how ecosystems, natural assets regulate the flows of material, essentially pollutants and water and carbon and so on. But then there's also these cultural ecosystem services, we call them. This is a category of lots of different ecosystem services, such as recreation benefits, tourism, education, volunteering. And we might think about visitor numbers to a particular site. and we sometimes work out what the value of that site is in terms of its recreation value based on how far people are willing to travel to get to that site and the cost that they incur in terms of their travel costs. But also education, volunteering, we can quantify that in terms of person hours worked, whereas there are other things that are more difficult to quantify. And one of those, interestingly, is the spiritual value of our natural assets. And maybe in our society, we're maybe a bit reluctant to recognize how important that element is. But for a long time in our country, that was a really important part of our landscape. And we think about sites like Stonehenge. There are parts of the country that people love going to because that does speak to them in a certain way. And there are, parts of the country which their landscape and the aesthetic of that landscape is really associated with a sense of place, which can be quite intangible. But when we start thinking about, well, what if that environment might change, that is something that we can then notice is important, and that can be considered another type of ecosystem service in that cultural category.
Thank you. So that kind of establishes what it is, and to an extent, some things are valued and actually marketed, some things aren't, and there are some of them which there is no quantification. It's kind of like intuitively, yes, if you do something to that habitat, the value will decrease, but we just can't put a number on it just yet.
Yeah.
Part of it as well. Let's tell us a bit about how, because that naturally leads into tell us how do you measure natural capital and the benefits of ecosystem services. Let's just build upon that with, I know there's a couple of metrics that are available, but how do we measure these in a kind of a standardized way?
Well, yeah, as I was saying, the great thing about in the UK in particular is having these standardized metrics now available through DEFRA's ENCA guidance, the Enabling Natural Capital guidance, and also a tool available from the Environment Agency, which is another acronym. It's the Natural Capital Register and Accounting Tool, or NCRAT, NCRAT. And what that enables us to do is provide standardized metrics. Of course, they are not perfect. There are limitations in there, there are caveats in there, but it does provide a standardized starting point to start quantifying and valuing these things. And the process that we always take with this is starting with our assets. So if we can quantify the assets that we have, so maybe we're working with a particular area of land, maybe we own a site or several sites. So we start by identifying what those assets are, what habitats do we have on that site, potentially also, what soils do we have, what waterways do we have, water bodies, hedges. So we start with our assets, and then we look at what ecosystem services they may be providing. And we do that through a kind of a screening exercise. And this can really be done, I think, always, it's kind of like a spectrum. You can do this at a very high level with very little generalized information, or you can get really quite detailed. So the ecosystem services your site may be delivering may be partly a function of it being open to the public, or maybe it has visitors, maybe it's a closed site because you've got also built infrastructure there that's delivering operational needs, but also the management of that land. How is that asset taken care of? Do you mow that asset? Maybe it's an area of grassland, maybe you're mowing that once a year, maybe you're not, maybe it's tenanted out and it's grazed by cattle, just an example there. So we start screening those ecosystem services and looking at which ones are important. And then we can start using these tools through ENCA and NCRAT to start putting metrics on those to quantify those services. So we can have things like kilograms of nitrate that may be running off the land versus things like the tons of carbon is stored in that soil and vegetation at that site, or the number of visitors that we have each year to that site for educational purposes. And then what we can do is look at the benefits and value of that. So some of those metrics will have monetary values associated with them, and this is usually collated through what's called a value transfer process. So ENCA and NCRAT work on this principle, which is there is a vast body of literature, academic, scientific, and economic research, which has gone into working out what the value of these ecosystem services are to society. Some of those are national studies, some of those are really site-specific studies, and they provide us with a value that's a kind of approximation that we can say, well, this site has some similarities to these studies, so we can infer that might be the value, and then we can then make an estimate as to how accurate that is likely to be. And that's essentially how we go from the assets to the services to the benefits and the value.
Yeah. Which is kind of the same as biodiversity net gain, right? It's the same sort of logic and process of converting something into something which is then quantifiable and then turn into an economic value. And the advantage, I guess, of economic value is that you can add them all together and then work out if I change it, like, am I making a percentage increase or decrease as a result?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that. Oh, sorry, Steve. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that. Yeah, that was a key point that at the end of that process, yes, so we valued all of these different ecosystem services, and then it's like, okay, great, what do we do now? So yeah, the point is that then gives us a common metric whereby we can compare those different ecosystem services, and then we can start exploring different scenarios. So we keep things as they are now with the baseline, or maybe we're going to introduce some woodland planting over here. Maybe we're going to lose some grassland over here to build a new built asset. And then we can start looking at, well, do we get a net gain or a net loss in terms of the natural capital benefits? You're totally right that the principle is the same in terms of how biodiversity net gain works. We can use this monetary value to look across multiple ecosystem services to see how that spread of benefits changes and that total ecosystem services value of that site changes. I'd say the difference, I guess, to biodiversity net gain and the metric that's used there is the natural capital approach kind of treats the biodiversity net gain as almost like an ecosystem service, and then we consider all of these other services together as well. So it kind of broadens that out into more than one metric, if you like.
So which is the idea behind the environmental benefits from nature tool, but in this case, you're quantifying it in the same way as biodiversity net gain. Let's jump onto the frameworks that we touched on are designed to help identify that's a balance across a series of metrics, but are there other key components to use in natural capital approaches? I mentioned risk management, stakeholder management.
Yeah, so that's right. So the things probably to mention here are, so we've got some metrics, we've got some quantified ecosystem services, we might have some monetary and economic values associated with that as well. But there are some other key parts of the natural capital approach which isn't only about quantification and valuation. What's also really important in this process is to consider risks and pressures on natural capital assets. And sometimes you may have come across this phrase of environmental net gain, which is an emerging policy idea being discussed at Natural England and DEFRA and the Environment Agency. And this is a way of thinking about, well, can we consider biodiversity net gain alongside natural capital and these risks and pressures facing our natural capital assets nationally, and then come up with a more rounded and holistic view on the sort of environmental outcomes that we're creating. Are we leaving the environment as a whole, not only biodiversity, in a better state than before? So that consideration of risks and pressures is key. Risks and pressures is key to the NCRAT tool that I mentioned. It's key to natural capital accounting and the British standard 8632. But it's also key to, of course, things like the TNFD framework, because impacts and dependencies translate into opportunities and risks. And like a really interesting example of how that has played out is on the CISL website. There's a whole range of TNFD case studies there, and there's an interesting one from a bank where they are a really big lender to farmers and agricultural businesses, and they were looking at what's the risk there associated with climate change and crop failure, and therefore how that might translate into defaults on payments and bankruptcy and so on. And obviously the kind of causal chain there of risk is that the individuals and businesses they're lending to are exposed to climate risk, and therefore they as a lender are exposed as well. So that's another way in which that can translate through as part of that kind of framework with the TNFD.
Let's move on to, I know we've touched on some standard metrics and the guidance how we should follow those and how they differ to an extent. But are there any standard frameworks that are commonly used? I mean, we've mentioned EBN and NCRAT for the UK, but how do we ensure that there's a consistent approach to natural capital or general accepted practice?
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing really is to understand, given your need and your context, what is the most appropriate guidance and framework and standard for you. If you're just starting out in this area and are maybe a little unsure, it's probably best to start with a few pilots and get to know some of those frameworks and guidance and standards. But the one that's really commonly used, I would say, in the UK is DEFRA's ENCA guidance, and a great starting point is the Environment Agency's NCRAT tool, the Natural Capital Register and Accounting tool, and that can provide a really useful template for starting to get to grips with that. And that is a standard approach that the EA in England has been trying to promote, and DEFRA with the ENCA guidance in England, but also it's relevant to all 4 nations as well. Other sort of standardized approaches, you mentioned the environmental benefits of nature tool. That's something that's been developed by Natural England, and that's more of a scoring kind of qualitative type approach, I guess, to looking at these ecosystem services, but it can be surprisingly data heavy, and maybe I think that it's the case that's still being developed, so probably NCRAT is more established. And as I say, the British standard, which is that's the go-to for natural capital accounting, really, which I would definitely encourage you to consider aligning with if you're looking at natural capital accounting. But as I say, it depends on your context. What do you need this for? Are you doing it in order to explore opportunities for using nature-based solutions on your land to deliver carbon sequestration and offset your emissions? Are you using this in order to seek funding and get private investment in nature recovery schemes? That'll sort of really determine ultimately the kind of tools and approach you use, but those kind of common ones I mentioned are a great starting point.
Fabulous. We'll move on to the next section. So I know that larger organisations in the UK, those which typically have more than 500 people or have revenue of 500 million a year, are required to produce a non-financial disclosure report, which includes carbon and is broadly aligned with TCFD, but there's no explicit requirements on natural capital or biodiversity. And we also, I think, the European Union's introducing reporting obligations on companies from 2025. That includes a disclosure on nature and biodiversity, and some organisations are starting to adopt TNFD for that framework. Presumably, as an extension to TCFD, I could be wrong there, but have I got that correct? Or is our obligations kind of the next natural thing? It's kind of coming anyway. I mean, you've mentioned biodiversity net gain is here. We could see an environmental net gain becoming this sort of evolution of biodiversity net gain. But this is kind of all converging, isn't it, into the company's got to report at some point on its risks from a nature-based perspective already. I know you mentioned that the companies actually require some disclosure on nature-related risks, but it's broadly people focus on carbon. Are the obligations coming? Do you think that's the next natural kind of thing which is going to happen?
Yes, and that seems to be the view of many people in this space regarding TNFD. That's commonly how it's introduced, is that at the moment it's voluntary, but look out, it's going to be mandatory at some point in the near future, just like TCFD is. And that does seem to be the case. But what I would also add to that is, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I would just challenge a little bit on the focus maybe of TCFD. So myself and colleagues at AtkinsRéalis have been supporting many infrastructure clients on their TCFD disclosures. And a key thing to note there is that natural assets are extremely important in adapting to and mitigating climate change, but also your natural assets are themselves at risk of climate impact. So there's this really interesting kind of feedback relationship between climate and nature. And what we found is that in some cases, those risks to natural assets are material in terms of how they are at risk from climate change for those organizations as well, particularly organizations that depend on water supply and have operations in flood risk prone areas. The other key part of this as well is around transition planning. So I think it was last year, there was a document brought out by the Transition Planning Task Force on the role of natural capital in the climate transition. So why I mention that is just to indicate that to some extent, there's already a need to look at natural capital in the context of climate. And the other element is as well, I would say, is that there is the regulatory element, but there's also this push coming from investors. So whether they're institutional investors, whether they're asset managers, one of our water company clients, their major shareholder that's managed by an asset manager that is undertaking a proactive corporate engagement with their investee companies on biodiversity. And so they are asking questions of their investee companies, well, what are you doing about these biodiversity risks? And this is, regardless of the fact that whether TNFD is mandatory or not. And the other point as well is that on the financing side of things as well, many investors are putting together natural capital investment products, or they have funds which are focused on companies that are leading in this space as well. So there's another drive coming from investors, and that's happening now as well, and is only going to increase. So yeah, it's coming. TNFD is coming, but there's also many other reasons for looking into this. And I would say the natural capital approach, whether that's a natural capital account or you're looking at your individual schemes and assessing projects, the natural capital approach is key to that. It's not the whole picture in terms of nature-related disclosure reporting, but having a natural capital account for your company and using it on projects is a really key starting point to building capacity in your organization to tackle nature risks and opportunities. And it'll go a long way to helping you be ready for when this does become mandatory.
So let's jump to, we're almost at the time for questions. In fact, we're probably over a little bit of time here, but could you say a little bit more about how do we use natural capital alongside biodiversity? And I think that's pretty obvious, actually, that it's kind of very similar, very complementary. But can you talk a bit about examples of using BNG and NCRAT in a combined solution for a client? And what do you see as the similarities of those metrics in a combined approach? And then we'll ask a question then afterwards around how do folks get help in actually creating what? Where do you start?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I can answer that, I guess, just by saying that, biodiversity can be the hook in to start thinking in terms of natural capital. So if we're looking at enhancing and creating habitats, as I say, that can come with a range of other benefits as well that can meet other objectives in your organization. So creating and enhancing habitat can improve things for biodiversity, but it can also help you with flood resilience or sequestering carbon or delivering social value. Maybe it's part of engagement with a local volunteering group to deliver some of those improvements, or a wildlife trust. So the advantage to using a natural capital approach alongside your work on biodiversity net gain is that, it's like a FOMO situation, like fear of missing out on all those wider benefits, and reporting those as part of a more holistic view. I think that's really part of it. And sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes carbon is the hook. Our clients are looking, how do we use our land to sequester carbon and offset our emissions? And then they realize also by doing this, they can enhance biodiversity. So it starts these conversations across different teams and across different objectives within organizations. So it's about thinking of nature as an asset that delivers multiple benefits and moving from this sort of single objective or single outcome focus.
And so in your experience, how do organizations typically start using natural capital? What's been the general direction once they start?
Yeah, so how I generally tend to start supporting organizations in using this kind of approach is starting small with a pilot, because it's way easier to understand and build capacity and also get buy-in if there's a small, relatively inexpensive example that you can use to showcase. And so I would say the best way to start out is to start small. So maybe you have a project that you've delivered in the past where you have tried out some kind of nature-based solution. If you're in the water space, maybe you've been doing some catchment management activities. If you're a housing developer, maybe you've done some green infrastructure creation. And what I would say is start by learning from those examples. So a way that we often start is actually with an evaluation of a past project, because it's been driven by maybe one or two outcomes, and they realize, well, actually, this has delivered way more value than we thought, or that we're aware at the time, or we could capture. And we can use this assessment as a kind of backwards looking kind of piece to evaluate that scheme. What we can then see is when our clients learn a little bit more about what we're quantifying, what we're valuing, they have a product that they can then take to their colleagues, other teams, showcase the value that their work has created. That can then start those discussions around, well, what if we could take a more holistic approach to this in the organization and be more strategic and join up these different teams that are maybe operating in different ways, but they have shared outcomes and goals. So that's the starting point. And then I would also always say, start with that guidance and standardized approaches and standard metrics, and then we can get into more detailed and nuanced type approaches. If you've got a really unique site, it's maybe easier to start high level with a more generic approach, and then get into the detail as a next step, because it can be expensive to consider things in a lot of detail. So yeah, starting small with those pilots and building from there.
And if the audience wants to find out more, clearly reach out to yourself, right? But can you advise them how to start a project? Is there a particular route into yourselves?
Yeah, so I think we'll be happy to share our brochure from AtkinsRéalis. So we've got a brochure that has a set of case studies. So, if you're interested in seeing some examples of how this works, we've got a few case studies from road, water, housing, or, a range of different applications. And yeah, some of those may speak to you more than other examples. So we can share that brochure, and that's got my contact details and details of colleagues as well. So definitely check that out. And the other thing that I would look at as well is the Biodiversity and Natural Capital Steering Group at IEMA. That's the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. And a couple of years ago, we produced a buzzword guide, which is a really great starting point to, what's the difference between nature-based solutions and natural capital? Or, what does biodiversity net gain mean versus just biodiversity? So that's a really great resource as well. And that's free online.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to summarize here. I think we've got 4 minutes left. So I think what we're going to do is I know we've had some questions which came in before the show. So I think what we'll do is probably document those and send them out to everybody that's attended today, so you've got the answers. But I wanted to just first of all summarize. I get the sense that there's a mindset change underway with society starting to think about how we value nature and incorporate changes in natural assets into decision making, which goes beyond that simple resource exploitation. And I think we've seen carbon, biodiversity, environmental consenting being rolled out as compliance obligations. In our previous superheroes discussions, we've learned obligations generally at the back end of the process. They're really about bringing process consistency and usually represent that final stage of sweeping up everybody in the market, so everybody does everything consistently. So we're seeing organizations build natural assessments into strategic decision making, going beyond what's already required for consenting and reporting today. If we expect that trend to continue, what is voluntary today can become mandatory or expected by business stakeholders. I think you said investors in the near future. Perhaps TNFD is that key driver that accelerates this journey. And natural capital, I think what we've learned today is, as an approach, it's been growing for many years now, but it's still a little way to being fully standardized, but it's getting there. At least in the UK, that's become perhaps more coherent with those de facto standards, frameworks like NCA and NCRAT. Maybe we'll start to see environmental net gain on the near horizon with BNG version 2 maybe. And such frameworks also becoming that core component to support TNFD going forward as well. So I just want to say a big thank you to John for coming on the show today. I wish we booked you for an hour and a half rather than an hour. Pretty much at top of the hour today. I'm sure there's lots more that we could dig into on natural capital. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for everybody for attending today.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone.